Our second speaker is Phillip Zapkin. He's an assistant teaching professor of English at Penn State University at University Park with a PhD from West Virginia University. His primary scholarly interest is contemporary adaptations of Greek drama, and he has a book that has just come out from Routledge, Hellenic Common, Greek Drama and Cultural Cosmopolitanism in the Neoliberal Era. His paper today is Tragic Traditions, African and Greek Accents, and Ahmed Yerima Otaelo, is that you say, maybe? I'll let him correct my pronunciation, and I hand it over to you, Phillip. Thank you.
Well, that's how I'm saying it, whether that's correct or not.
If you and I say it the same way, then we're correct.
First off, thanks, Alan, for that introduction and for organizing the panel. I'd like to thank all of the rest of you for joining me here. Alan did invite me to share a picture of my book cover with you, which I don't have on my jump drive, but I happen to have a copy with me, so I'll hold that up for you. As Alan said, my paper is entitled Tragic Traditions, African and Greek Accents in Ahmed Yerima's Otello. In the author's note published with the Kraft Griot's version of Nigerian playwright Ahmed Yerima's play Otello, Yerima writes, "It was for me and millions of dramatists like me to translate William Shakespeare's works into our own language, into our cultural reality, into our human, social, and religious sensibility. This is why I've written my own version of Shakespeare's Othello." Indeed, in adapting Othello, Yerima joins a number of other African dramatists who've adapted the bard's work for their own cultural and political contexts. Shakespeare's role in post-colonial African nations is a complex one because his work was often imposed through the British colonial education system in order to show the superiority of British culture. However, many African dramatists retain a deep admiration for Shakespeare. Now, despite identifying Otello as an Othello adaptation, I argue that Yerima's play is distinctly hybrid, incorporating both classical Greek and African dramaturgical elements, and addressing the Osu caste system practiced by some Igbo people. In other words, Yerima's Otello is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Othello, but it is a complex, multifaceted adaptation reflecting a tendency among West African adapters to blend multiple dramatic influences. To begin, Otello is very clearly taking its cue from Othello, with the majority of its plot following Shakespeare's lead, though with some significant divergences. The play opens with Chinyere, daughter of the Igwe, or the king, who is Yerima's version of Desdemona. Chinyere is not the king. We learn that the river goddess Osimiri has claimed Chinyere as a servant, and that if Chinyere refuses, she is doomed to lose her sanity or to die. Then we're introduced to the Igwe himself and to Otello, a member of the Osu caste whom the king has taken as a servant and brought to battle in defiance of Igbo customs that declare Osus untouchable. Otello's social status, which will be discussed more below, takes the place of Venetian racism in Shakespeare's play, though the effect is quite similar. Because he's done good service in battle, including saving the Igwe's life, Otello has been elevated to high status. In a fateful gesture of gratitude, the Igwe offers Otello any boon he chooses, and Otello asks for Chinyere's hand in marriage. For the court and Igbo society, this is an unthinkable marriage, because Osus are not even meant to interact with freeborn people, much less marry them, and anyone who does marry an Osu becomes a social outcast themselves. Which is a major problem, obviously, when it comes to a member of the royal family. However, unbeknownst to anyone else, Chinyere and Otello are already in love. Now, the Igwe is caught between the social customs that enforce separation between Osus and freeborn people on the one hand, and the social custom requiring him to honor his promise to give Otello whatever he asks for. After consulting the gods, the Igwe decides to honor his word, which enrages many of the courtiers, especially Agbo, this play's version of Iago. Agbo begins scheming to destroy the Igwe, but especially to destroy Otello. He eventually hits upon a plot where his wife will borrow the distinctive Jigida beaded belt that Otello has given Chinyere, and Agbo uses that belt to spark Otello's jealousy in the same way Iago uses Desdemona's handkerchief. Otello is especially susceptible to this suspicion because of the caste difference between himself and Ciniere. And at the play's climax, Otello strangles Ciniere with the jigira before Agbo's wife reveals the entire scheme. The Igwe and his retinue arrive, including Agbo, and the Igwe loses his mind with grief before Otello stabs both Agbo and himself. Now, while much of this follows Shakespeare's plot, Yerima's play blends in both West African and Greek tragic elements. Perhaps the most obvious African component is the focus on the Osu caste system, which is a distinct practice of some Igbo people in southeast and south-central Nigeria. This caste system, which creates stark boundaries between Osus and all other members of society, is a source of deep oppression. Lekan Balagun characterizes the Osu system as based on restrictive segregation, with Osus consecrate to the service of the gods but exiled from normal society. He writes, "The Osu is not classified into any of Igbo society's social groups, not even as normal slaves who might one day lose their slave status and become freeborn. Once dedicated to a god, she or he stays dedicated all his life, and the same conditions apply to anyone who comes in deep physical contact with them. They both stand the ultimate risk of rejection by their people and becoming outsiders in their native community as stipulated by the age-long culture and tradition." Otello rejects the subservience and isolation of his Osu status, and through this Yerima questions the ongoing inequality of the caste system in Igbo society. Otello's adoptive father Ebuka advises his son not to overreach and not to give in to pride, which Balagun links to Macbeth and King Lear as additional Shakespearean intertexts. But Otello rejects these pleas, instead asking, "Why must I always lose everything? Why can I not just be a man?" In much the same way racism undergirds the tragic outcome in Othello, in Otello tragic fate is driven by the inequalities of the Igbo caste system. In addition to the Osu system, Otello draws on Igbo religion and myth to move the plot forward, another distinctly African addition to the Shakespearean source. According to Ade Adinjini and Nii Usunbade, Yerima tactically locates his stories in the various Nigerian cultures to give it a sense of reality. His treatments of characters and issues reveal a clear indication of Yerima's mastery of the people's aspects of culture such as proverbs, wise sayings, norms, ethics and codes, religions and expressions. Indeed, Yerima has written whole plays based on the myths of Nigerian peoples, like his play Yemoja, which recounts a mythical story about the titular Yoruba river goddess, and is a really good read, by the way. In Otello, Igbo gods and divination play a significant role, much more significant than the divine plays in Shakespeare's Othello. As I've already mentioned, the goddess Osimiri has chosen Ciniere as a servant, and if Ciniere refuses, then she will be doomed. Right from the beginning of the play, the fatalistic power of the gods is established, a tendency much more in line with both African animistic religion and Greek tragic drama than anything seen in Othello. Alongside this, the play incorporates divination and prophecy. The specific form of divination is distinctly West African, but there are also echoes of the Delphic oracle whose cryptic messages drive many of the plots of Greek tragedy. When the Igwe is stuck between the dictates of the caste system and is promised to reward Otello, he sends for the seer Okomaru. Initially, Okomaru speaks in proverbs and riddles like the Delphic oracle, telling the Igwe and the court, "The vulture in mistake took the child of the hen on impulse, only to find out that it is too frail to die. What then will the vulture eat? A man?" Following this cryptic statement, Okomaru explains things much more clearly and explicitly. The gods are angry with the Igwe, but his household deity is interceded on his behalf, so Ciniere and Otello are to be married, but there can be no celebration, and they must immediately leave the kingdom, and neither they nor their children may ever return. The king also must perform a cleansing ritual sacrifice to purify the land. This fate is rooted both in West African religion and in Greek tragedy, especially the Greek condemnation of hubris. Although Aristotle doesn't actually use the word hubris in the Poetics, he describes the process by which a tragic hero should fall from grace. Misfortune, however, is brought upon him not by vice and depravity, but by some error of judgment, of the number of those in the enjoyment of great reputation and prosperity. Frequently, this error is some type of hubris, or overwhelming pride that challenges the gods themselves. We see this, for instance, with Oedipus's and Creon's refusal to heed Tiresias's warnings, with Ajax's rejection of Athena's help on the battlefield, and in other Greek tragic figures. By contrast, in Othello, the hero makes no bold or prideful declarations, though other characters in Shakespeare do. Othello is, in point of fact, more inclined to humility, often downplaying his virtues. And in this way, Otello differs from his Shakespearean model because he does glorify himself, overtly setting himself against fate and the gods. In explaining that he will not return to the Osu community with Ibuka, his adoptive father, Otello says, "Here I am, me, a mere mortal, though not fit to be called a man greater than the god Allah." And Ibuka says, "Caution, son, you anger the god Allah," and he retaliates. Otello says, "Let him. Retaliates? Which god? I'm greater than the god Allah. I'm greater than all men. Through my bravery I turn my black blood red. Yes, old man, I am equal to the god Allah." These lines are about as hubristic as you can get. Otello is brave, and he has been rewarded for his courage and willingness to sacrifice himself, being raised up above many freeborn nobles in the kingdom, and certainly well higher than any Osu. But rather than accept these advancements with humility and grace, Otello's head swells and he sets his own might against the gods, who then use tragic fate to strike him down by exploiting his weakness, his sensitivity about social status. Because part of Otello remains convinced that a princess could never love an Osu, Agbo is able to fan the flames of jealousy that ultimately lead to the play's tragic end. There is an important difference, however, between the Greek treatment of hubris and West African treatments of hubris. For the Greeks, hubris was an individual error, through which the tragic protagonist brings suffering primarily to himself and the immediate family group. By contrast, in West African tragedy, the crisis is often centered in the community as a whole. For instance, in perhaps the Nigerian play best known in the West, Wole Soyinka's Death in the King's Horseman, when Elisine fails to complete a ritual suicide, the community is thrown into chaos because without the spirit of his horseman, Elisine, the recently dead king's spirit cannot travel to the afterlife, which means he will not be able to join the ancestors and ensure blessings for the whole community. In Otello, the danger is not as overtly communal as in Soyinka's play, but there's still a clear communal concern about the danger of hubris. This concern is expressed through the use of proverbs to warn characters against negative or antisocial behavior, another typical element of African dramaturgy. After Otello's declaration of superiority over the gods, Ibuka tells his adopted son, "Let the cock crow alone, soon it will fill the old woman's pot." Although Otello admits he doesn't understand the meaning of this proverb, Ibuka is clearly trying to warn the young man about the dangers of attempting to stand alone without the support of a community, particularly when that involves declaring oneself above one's social position. Now, ironically, Agbo is given more direct advice about not giving in to hubris. When Agbo voices his disgust at the Igwe's support for the Osu Otello, his friend counsels, "In this case I want you to be a wise man. Do not push the gods or they may trip you." These proverbs reflect community wisdom, handed down through generations in order to guide good behavior. The focus on remaining humble, remaining grounded within one's community, and of not challenging the gods reflects particular moral attitudes held by the Igbo. And while these are beneficial lessons for individuals, the fact that they're couched in and conveyed through the medium of proverb indicates that the community as a whole has a vested interest in this moral behavior. The communal wisdom reflects attempts to guide characters away from the very behaviors that ultimately lead to the tragic conclusion. Like many African adapters of Shakespeare, the Greeks or other European classical drama, Ahmed Yerima's Otaelo goes well beyond a single source text, instead reimagining Othello for contemporary Nigeria. Yerima creates a hybrid text, incorporating a number of different dramaturgical traditions and blending them into a single new work. This is one of the great potentials of adaptation. By blending various source texts, traditions, performance styles, cultural elements, etc., it can draw forth from a source text new meanings and create new relevance for contemporary audiences in contexts far removed from those of an earlier source. By bringing together Shakespeare's Othello, African dramaturgy, and Greek tragical influences, Yerima has created a new work of art for 21st century Nigeria. He's made Shakespeare's play speak specifically to the problems of his country and his time. Thank you.